September 1939, Berlin. The Reichsmarschall stood before the microphones in a white uniform heavy with decorations he had earned in another war, and gave the German people his personal guarantee. No enemy bomber, Hermann Göring declared, would ever reach the Ruhr, would ever reach the Reich, would ever touch the roofs of Berlin. And then he sealed it with the sentence that would follow him to his grave. If a single enemy aircraft crosses our borders, he said, you can call me Meier. The crowd laughed with him. It was the most confident promise any man in Germany could make, made by the one man whose job was to keep it. What Göring didn't know, what no one applauding that white uniform could possibly imagine, was that his capital would be bombed 363 times. That before it ended, more than 1,000 bombers would come in a single morning, in daylight, unhidden and unhurried. That close to 70,000 tons of bombs would fall on the city he had sworn to keep untouched, and that the people of Berlin, huddled in cellars beneath the fires, would find their own use for his promise. This is the story of a guarantee, and of the 6 years it took to break it beyond repair. The promise was not madness. That is what the newsreels never explain. In 1939, Hermann Göring commanded the most powerful air force on earth, and he had the credentials to lead it. He was an ace of the First War with 22 victories, the last commander of the Richthofen Squadron, holder of Prussia's highest decoration for valor. His fighters had just helped dismantle Poland in 5 weeks. Berlin sat deep inside the Reich, beyond the reach of any escorted raid, ringed by radar, searchlights, and the heaviest flak belt ever built around a city. British bombers flying that far would arrive alone at night over a blacked-out capital defended by men who could see them coming. Every professional airman in Europe would have called the oath an exaggeration. Very few would have called it a lie. For 11 months, the promise held perfectly. Then, on the night of August 25th, 1940, it cracked. British bombs had been ordered onto Berlin within a day of German bombs falling on London, and some 90 aircraft groped their way across the dark to the capital. As an attack, it achieved almost nothing. Clouds covered the city. Most bombs fell on farms and summer houses at the edges, and Berliners walked out the next morning to stare at small craters in vegetable gardens. But the sirens had sounded over Berlin, and the word Meier moved through the city in a whisper with a smile in it. Days later, the bombers came back, and this time Berliners were killed in their own streets, the first of the war. Adolf Hitler answered from the podium within the week, shouting that if the enemy attacked German cities, Germany would erase theirs. The Luftwaffe turned away from the British airfields it had been grinding down and threw itself at London instead. The broken promise had already changed the course of the war, and the men who broke it had barely scratched the city. Through 1941 and 1942, the raids stayed small, scattered, and survivable, and the Reichsmarschall treated each one as beneath his notice. When Soviet naval bombers reached Berlin from the Baltic Islands in August 1941, dropping a handful of bombs on the blacked-out city, German radio dismissed the raid so completely that it blamed the British for it. Terror pinpricks, the official line ran, the last gasps of enemies already beaten. And for a while, the ledger seemed to agree with him. British losses over Germany climbed, the raids on the capital thinned, and Göring repeated his guarantee in speeches with the confidence of a man collecting on a bet. Every quiet month fed the promise. Every quiet month made the accounting, when it finally came, worse. Before the humiliation gets worse for the Reichsmarschall, and it gets much worse, one small request, tracing a single broken promise across 6 years of records, takes time, and the like button is how you tell me it was worth it. Now, the next blow did not come at night, and it did not miss. It came by appointment, January 30th, 1943, the 10th anniversary of Nazi rule, and Göring was scheduled to address the nation by radio in the morning. At the exact hour of his broadcast, British Mosquito bombers came over Berlin in daylight, so fast that the flak never touched them, and the Reichsmarschall's speech went silent for an hour while the country listened to static. That afternoon, a second wave arrived on time for the next speech. The bombs were small, the message was not. The fastest aircraft in Europe had just crossed the borders he had guaranteed twice in one day to a schedule printed in the newspapers. In the shelters, Berliners had long since renamed the air raid sirens Meier's trumpets, they called them. By 1943, the joke had teeth. That November, the man in charge of Britain's bombers decided to collect on the promise in full. Air Marshal Arthur Harris put it in writing to Churchill in a single cold calculation. It will cost us between 400 and 500 aircraft, he wrote. It will cost Germany the war. Through the winter, Bomber Command came for Berlin again and again. 16 major raids, thousands of sorties, whole districts burning from the government quarter to the zoo. More than 1 million Berliners bombed out of their homes. And here, the record demands honesty. Berlin did not break. The city was too vast, too modern, too fiercely defended. Its 3 great flak towers firing from concrete walls thicker than a man is tall, while tens of thousands sheltered inside them. On a single November night, the bombs gutted the Kaiser Wilhelm Memorial Church on the Kurfürstendamm and burned the zoo district around it, and Berliners walking to work the next morning passed the bodies of the zoo's animals laid out along the avenue. Inside the flak towers, as many as 15,000 people at a time waited out the raids behind walls that nothing in the British bomb bays could open. Bomber Command lost more than 500 aircraft over Berlin that winter, and the war went on. The first half of Harris's sentence came true almost exactly. The second half did not. In the spring, the night raids ebbed, and a man determined to misread the ledger could still claim the capital had held. Then the Americans came, and they came in daylight. In March 1944, more than 700 American heavy bombers fought their way to Berlin under a roof of escort fighters and bombed it at noon, daring the Luftwaffe to rise and be destroyed. The Luftwaffe rose, and it was, and on the 3rd of February, 1945, the oath was buried in the sight of the whole city. 1,003 American bombers crossed those guaranteed borders in a single morning stream, and for close to 2 hours the bombs walked through the heart of the capital, through the ministries, the railway stations, the courts. Close to 3,000 Berliners died before lunch. Among them was Roland Freisler, the screaming judge of the People's Court, the man who had sentenced the German resistance to death by the hundred, killed in his own courthouse by a promise-breaking bomb while the trials on his docket waited. Even Berliners with nothing left found something in that. 6 weeks later, the Americans returned with 1,250 bombers, the largest daylight raid Berlin ever suffered, and the flak towers fired into a sky so full of aircraft that the gunners no longer needed to aim. The man who had promised that not one would ever come now lived in a Reich where they arrived by the thousand, on schedule, in formation, in the middle of the day. The last bombs of the promise fell in April 1945, and when the bombers finally stopped, it was only because the Soviet artillery was close enough to take over the work. The final accounting reads like the verdict it was. 363 air raids on the guaranteed city, close to 70,000 tons of bombs, at least 20,000 Berliners dead by the most careful counts, and a capital so ruined that clearing the rubble would take a generation of Berlin's women working in lines. Göring himself was captured in May and put on trial at Nuremberg, where the prosecution screened films of the burned cities to the men in the dock. Witnesses recorded that some of the accused could not watch. He was sentenced to hang. And on the night before the sentence, on the 15th of October, 1946, he swallowed cyanide in his cell. He was 53 years old. The man who had staked his name on the sky over Berlin had lived to see that sky filled morning after morning with everything he had promised was impossible. One of his own pilots left the cleanest verdict. Adolf Galland, the fighter general who had defended the Reichswehr until the last month, wrote after the war that the failure was decided not over Berlin, but in the factories his enemies commanded, that for every German fighter that rose, the enemy could build 10 bombers to meet it. The oath of 1939 had never really been a promise about courage. It had been a promise about arithmetic, made by a man who refused to do it. In Berlin today, one of the great flak towers still stands. The Humboldt Tower was too massive to demolish, So the city buried half of it and left the rest. And on summer evenings, Berliners climb its concrete walls with ropes and stand on the gun platform to watch the sun set over a rebuilt city. Guides tell visitors what the tower was for, and somewhere in every telling, the old sentence surfaces, the one about Meier, repeated now for 90 years, longer than the Reich it embarrassed lasted, longer than the man who said it. In 1939, Hermann Göring swore that no bomb would ever fall on Berlin. The bombs fell for 5 years, 363 times. And in the shelters beneath the burning streets, right up until the end, the sirens still played Meier's trumpets. You have just watched a 6-year promise come apart raid by raid, from a whispered joke in 1940 to 1,000 bombers in broad daylight. Stories like this one rarely end where the newsreels stop, and tracing them all the way down is what this channel is for. Subscribe to Frontline Echoes, and you will never be left wondering how these stories truly ended.